Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the ASUS ROG GR70 mini gaming PC. Now, not to be confused with the ROG NUC, although they do look basically identical, instead of an Intel Core Ultra CPU, we instead find the high-end Ryzen 9 9955HX 3D processor. Given that NUC used to be an Intel thing which ASUS then took on, I guess the fact we're using an AMD CPU here does explain why they're not using NUC branding. But either way, this is a very compact mini PC with just a 3 litre capacity that is all about gaming, considering it packs in that high-end Ryzen CPU as well as Nvidia discrete mobile graphics. Let's find out exactly how good this thing really is if you're interested in a gaming PC. We'll start then by going over the core spec of the GR70, as like we said, it does have that Ryzen 9 9955HX 3D CPU that comes with 3D V-Cache, alongside 32 gigs of DDR5 5600 memory. It does look like I have a reviewer's special unit though, as any official retail model that comes with this CPU should have the RTX 5070 laptop alongside a 2TB Gen 4 SSD, whereas I was sent a model that has a 1TB Gen 5 SSD, as well as the RTX 5060 laptop GPU. Complicating things further is that right now I haven't been able to find any official retail listings here in the UK. I just saw this one listing on eBay which puts the price at £2,400 for the 5070 model, though I have no idea how accurate that will be. With that in mind, it's probably best to think of this video as more of a general review of the GR70 family as a whole rather than a review of one specific model. I have of course reached out to ASUS to clarify UK pricing and availability. I haven't heard back at the time of filming, but of course if I do hear back I will leave a pinned comment down below. Either way, the fact that this machine does pack in the RTX 5060 discrete laptop GPU as well as the 9955HX 3D processor, I think is very impressive considering it is a tiny form factor with volume coming in at just 3 litres. Naturally, being an ROG product, it does have some gamery design elements, including the ROG ventilation cutouts on the right hand side, while the left hand side features an RGB ROG logo under some translucent plastic. Basically, if you imagined ROG making a mini gaming PC, I think it would look something like this one. Its overall shape and the built-in stand giving it quite an upright appearance does remind me a little bit of the PS5, though obviously it is far smaller and isn't designed to be put sideways either. As for the front I/O, this consists of 2 Type-A 10GB per second USB ports, and there's 1 Type-C, along with a headphone jack and the power button, and there is also a tiny RGB strip at the top. Round the back though, we find 4 more USB Type-A ports, 2.5GB Ethernet, and then 1 USB 4 Type-C, so that's 40GB per second, and it does support DP Alt Mode video out. Then we find 2 DisplayPort 2.1 and 2 HDMI 2.1 video outputs as well. It's certainly a decent selection overall, and I like the fact that there is a front USB-C port. I say that the only real miss is the lack of an SD card reader, but again, considering the GR70 is aimed primarily towards gamers rather than creators means it's probably not the end of the world, but again, it would have been a nice inclusion. ASUS does have a really neat trick up its sleeve though, with this genius piece of design as to how you access the internals. Basically, you only need to unscrew this captive thumb screw on the back and then the hold side panel just slides off. Now be careful as it is attached with 1 wire for the RGB lighting, but you can remove that and get full access to everything that's user upgradable. That includes memory, which by default is occupied with 2 16GB DDR5 5600 SODIMMs from Samsung, though it does support up to 96GB if somehow you were to win the lottery and want to upgrade your mini PC. Now the primary storage is technically upgradable, but in my unit it's a Gen 5 SSD with a dedicated fan and heatsink. Specifically, it's the Samsung PM9E1, so I did leave it alone here, but there is a spare Gen 4 2280 slot at the top of the PCB as well. We can also see the MediaTek Wi-Fi 7 module up there too. Now you can also access the other side of the motherboard by removing 1 screw and then popping off the side panel, which does give access to the CPU and GPU, though obviously they are installed underneath their cooling apparatus and they're not themselves user upgradable, but I guess it's handy if you want to clean the fans or something like that. Overall then, with access to both storage and memory, it's about as upgradable as you'd expect for a PC of this size, and again, hats off to ASUS for making it so easy to access the internals. That really is a fantastic feature.
Built for what lies beyond. Raw power, engineered for dominance. Every system pushed beyond limits. Whether you need a custom build or one ready for launch tomorrow, CyberPower PC powers your next conquest. So don't wait, conquer the cosmos.
Moving on then to start looking at testing. The first thing you need to know is that there are 3 different performance modes you can access in Armoury Crate, although you can also configure them in the BIOS too. These are the silent, performance and turbo modes, and performance is the default. Of course, me being me, I tested all 3 of these modes to find out how they change various CPU behaviour, and the findings are pretty interesting. If we start off with the performance mode, we're looping Cinebench here, which immediately saw the CPU package power hit 160 watts and temperatures basically hit 100 degrees straight away, which I guess is perhaps not too surprising considering that much power in such a small machine. Power quickly drops back to 120 watts though, and temperatures do drop slightly, but we still saw them in the low to mid 90s. However, running the test for 30 minutes total shows that package power does drop again to 100 watts, and temperatures are now slightly improved at that lower power figure. Clock speed is around 4.1 to 4.2 GHz all cores in this scenario at the end of the test. As for the turbo mode then, it also boosts to 160 watts initially, with temperatures spiking up massively to 100°C before power drops, but this time to 130 watts, not 120 watts, though that clearly doesn't help much as thermals are still incredibly high. Fast forward to the end of the test though, and power drops again, but it still maintains 120 watts, and temperatures are still at 100 degrees, which is honestly just ludicrous as the GR70 clearly cannot maintain such a high power level for the CPU, so I really do not recommend turbo mode whatsoever. Silent mode though is definitely what I'd recommend for day-to-day usage if you're not gaming, as it's much quieter given it runs the CPU at significantly lower power, settling around 80 watts at the end of our stress test, with temperatures in the high 70s or low 80s. Speaking of noise, both the turbo and performance mode maxed out the fan speed in my testing, so there wasn't really any noticeable difference between the two, but as I said, silent is much easier on the ears, and here's a quick sound test. On first impressions then, the GR70 appears to be a classic example of a machine packing in such a high power CPU into such a compact chassis, resulting in both temperatures and noise levels hitting extremely high levels. I guess the good news is that for gaming things are not nearly quite so bad. That's because I ran through another 30-minute gaming load here in Cyberpunk and found that GPU cooling is absolutely fine. Turbo mode does run slightly cooler, but not by much, and even in performance mode it's still only around 70 degrees for the GPU and 64 degrees on the memory, so for all my gaming tests I did stick with the performance mode. It's also good to see that there's no external hotspots to worry about when using our thermal imaging camera, so the chassis stays cool to the touch, with most of the heat coming out of the rear where the air is escaping. Moving on to our game benchmarks then, here I tested 5 different titles but across a range of different resolutions and settings. That's because I was thinking if I owned the GR70, I'd probably hook it up to my TV and use it almost like a Steam machine, so I was really curious to see what the frame rates would be like outputting at 4K resolution. Now, obviously, a RTX 5060 laptop GPU is not going to do 4K native, but instead I tested using DLSS performance mode, which is a 1080p internal resolution, to see how it would fare. I also tested some games as well using native 1080p across a range of different image quality presets, so let's dive in and see how the GR70 got on. Starting off then with Call of Duty Black Ops 7 at 4K basic preset using DLSS performance. Overall performance is fine but not spectacular, hovering right around the 60 to 70 FPS zone, which is playable but perhaps not what you'd want from a shooter like this. Dropping to native 1080p though does make a huge difference, this time bringing FPS up to and often over 100 FPS. You do lose the sharpness and clarity of the 4K output, but I do think it could be worth it for increased performance in this title. Next up we have Cyberpunk 2077, and we're starting off at 4K using DLSS performance. I was a little bit ambitious and tried the high preset, though that didn't get us much over 50 frames per second, so it's fine but not super smooth. Dropping to the medium preset does get us closer to 60 frames per second, but still not above that figure, so it's really not a huge improvement either way. Now, I did actually try leveraging frame generation though, back on the high preset for increased visuals, and now we're looking at frame rates in the high 70s to even low 80s, but do be aware of the latency. Averaged over the benchmark run, we saw 58 milliseconds PC latency with frame gen on, compared to 41 milliseconds without it, which is probably not a huge deal to most, but is worth keeping in mind. Next up then we have Doom the Dark Ages, again 4K DLSS performance, this time using the low preset, and I even reduced the texture pool size as low as it will go. Even then, performance is not great, starting in the low 40s and sometimes touching the 50 FPS zone, so I thought maybe this would be a prime contender for some frame gen action. As it turns out, enabling frame gen actually pushes things over the 8GB frame buffer of the 5060 laptop, and performance drops off a cliff, so you're much better playing off at native 1080p, where we're now looking at frame rates in the 70 and 80 FPS region, which is much smoother overall. As for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 then, here again I started at 4K using DLSS performance mode on the high preset, and once again we're looking at FPS in the low 50s range, so it's fine, just nothing amazing. Dropping down to the low preset does improve performance into the high 60s and low 70s, but pop-in becomes extremely jarring, so I just can't recommend that mode whatsoever. Instead, I found that native 1080p is probably the way to go. I really noticed the loss of sharpness compared to 4K DLSS performance in this title, but frame rates do shoot up into the 70 FPS region, sometimes touching 80 FPS, so it's probably a compromise worth making. Lastly, we come to Starfield, which at 4K DLSS performance mode using medium settings is pretty choppy at barely 40 FPS, so I quickly switched to low, and that gets us closer to 50 FPS, but it also looks a heck of a lot worse for not much frame rate gain. In fact, even enabling frame gen barely gets us past 60 FPS, or average PC latency almost doubles from 34 milliseconds without frame gen to 60 milliseconds with it enabled. That meant dropping back to native 1080p, and we're back at the medium preset though, and where we're now in the mid 50s, so again, still not incredible, but it is playable. That's it for our first set of game benchmarks then, but the other area I wanted to look at was how the GR70 stacks up when compared to a near enough equivalent full-on desktop PC. After all, it's packing the 9955 HX3D, which is probably AMD's fastest gaming CPU for laptops, and the 5060 laptop chip only has 13% fewer cores than the full-fat 5060 for desktops. So I took my regular MSI GPU test rig, which has a 9800X3D, and stuck in the RTX 5060 desktop GPU. And now we're going to run through those benchmarks again and see how performance stacks up. Now, obviously we're not expecting performance to be identical, and there is a gap in Call of Duty, but it honestly wasn't as big as I was expecting. Both machines were over 100 FPS at 1080p using basic settings, and averaged over the course of the bench, the GR70 came in 18% slower than our desktop system. As for Cyberpunk, that gap actually shrinks to just 14%, which is really very good going considering the size and power constraints of the GR70, with our desktop machine typically in the high 50s or low 60s, whereas the GR70 was often in the high 40s or low 50s. Doom is another one where at 1080p high settings the difference isn't huge. We're looking at an average of 57 FPS for the GR70 and just 64 FPS for my desktop machine, and that is just an 11% margin, which is really good going for the GR70 despite the GPU having 13% fewer cores, as we said. In fact, that gap only gets smaller in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, with often just a handful of frames separating the two machines, and over the course of the benchmark run, the GR70 came in just 8% slower, so this is really good going. Lastly though, we do have Starfield, and this one does show a much larger difference this time around, with our GR70 averaging 54 FPS compared to 71 FPS for the desktop system, so that works out at a 24% deficit for the ROG Mini PC, though as we saw, the difference is typically smaller. That brings us on to the end of the video then, and overall the ASUS GR70 is certainly an interesting machine, and I can definitely see why it would appeal, considering it packs in the Ryzen 9 9955 HX3D CPU alongside Nvidia discrete graphics in such a tiny 3-litre chassis. Of course, to get the biggest negative out of the way first, putting such a high-power CPU into such a compact system obviously has repercussions, and during a Cinebench load we did see CPU temperatures hitting 100 degrees almost immediately, and fan noise gets incredibly loud to deal with the heat. ASUS has basically just been too greedy with the power draw, as when we use the silent mode, which drops CPU power back, thermals were miles better. But this is absolutely something to be aware of if you're planning on running some intensive workloads and doing more than just gaming with this machine. The good news though is that the gaming experience itself is pretty dang good. In fact, if you bought a GR70, it will be even better than what I've shown in this video, given it's actually meant to come with the 5070 and not the 5060 that my sample has for whatever reason. Still, as we saw, it's very capable for 1080p gaming, and even some titles work fine at 4K if you use DLSS performance mode. Overall frame rates weren't even that far off my full-blown desktop equivalent used for testing with a 9800 X3D and RTX 5060 desktop card, so you really don't lose too much by going for the ultra small form factor. It's also very easy to get inside and access the internals, which I love to see, while I/O is generally solid as well and only seems to be missing an SD card reader, but I don't see that as a massive deal. Now, because pricing and availability has not yet been confirmed at the time of filming, I was only able to find this single eBay listing and I have no idea if the pricing is accurate. That does mean it's harder to give a proper judgment call as to whether or not you should buy the GR70. The only thing I would say is that it will absolutely have a price premium over an equivalent desktop system, purely because you're paying for the compact nature of the machine. So I guess you'll just have to work out how much of a premium you are willing to pay for the small form factor, and you also have to weigh whether or not you can live with the extremely high fan noise. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this video, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, leave a comment down below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. And if you want to carry on the conversation, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description below. While there, you'll also find links to both our merch store and our Patreon if you want to help us out that way. But that is really it for this one guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.